So, how do I say this? I wish I'd said this better last night when I was doing kind of the preview preliminary version of this lecture. I've been living with this material since late March or April when I first decided that we were going to talk about David. And so I've been studying it, I've been processing it, I've been writing it, I've been editing it, and all that kind of thing. And so after a while, some of these stories start to get a little mechanical to me. But last night I realized that for some people, the story that we're going to do today is not only really fresh, it's even raw. Today we're going to be talking about David and Absalom. And what I want to go ahead and say here is this is a hard story. The Bible is about real life. It's about real people. It's about real families. And it hit me last night as I was looking around the room that there were people in that room who were dealing with Absalom and David type stuff in their lives. And so I want you to know that when, as I go through this, some of this we're going to have to go through quickly because there's a lot of material, but I want you to know please don't think that I'm not sensitive to what's present in this room right now. Even as a dad, as I went back and I read the story of Absalom again, when you're a parent, if you have any relationships in your family, this story hits home. So please, if this is one of those days. Heck, I'm never offended when people get up and walk out. That's just kind of part of the course. But if you get up and walk out today, I understand that. But I also want to say that, if this story lands in a really hard way today, please let me know. Talk to other people in here because this is real stuff, and I want us to approach it appropriately, which means truthfully, academically, but not just that way. So it's not going to be all that. I'm going to try and keep it palatable. But start off with a story. Back in 1801, the English warship Thermopylae took another French warship off of the coast of Egypt. And when the battle was over and the French warship was boarded, they found out that it seemed to be a waste of time. They didn't find anything but some camp supplies, some furniture, some trunks full of clothing, and bags of mail from the French army, and even a couple of things that were just, random personal items. And they thought that, well, at least we've got this ship off of the seas. But for the most part, as far as loot or strategic value, this seems to have been a bust. That is, until they started going through those bags of mail and they found in that a courier's sack with a letter from Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the commander of the French forces in Egypt. He was the Emperor of France. And that letter was a letter written to Napoleon's wife, Josephine. And the subject of the letter was divorce. Napoleon wanted to divorce his wife, the Empress Josephine. Josephine never got the letter, but she did read it. She read it because it was published in a French newspaper after having been published in an English newspaper. So talk about being the last one invited to the party. She got that news and found out that her husband, who was away on campaign, wanted to divorce her. So what happened? For months, one of Europe's greatest military men became the laughingstock of Europe and was nearly paralyzed politically, not because he'd suffered defeat on the battlefield, but because the world had seen his family's dirty laundry. We've been talking about the pitfalls of success in the life of David. We've been talking about how hubris can take over, how we begin to think that it's all about us and not about God. There are so many things that can happen, and that success is actually one of the biggest danger factors that people can face. We talked about that with Saul. We're talking about that. We talked about that last week with David and Bathsheba, and that's going to continue. But scandal and tragedy in royal families is a long and well-documented reality. I mean, over the last couple of decades, haven't we seen the reputation of England's royal house of Windsor crash to the ground at times? How many of you all watched The Crown on Netflix? Story about the inner workings of Queen Elizabeth. I mean, that it's not just the royal family of England. You've got our own great families in this country, the DuPonts, the Kennedys, others, I hate to say them and call them one of the great families, but the Kardashians. I mean, all these famous families in our culture who rise up and then crash down. Their family's history, all their dirty laundry aired for everyone to see. Even the White House, administration after administration, we see it time and time again. The family, the personal stuff of the president's family gets out, and it's dragged through the mud. And the fact is that when we see those things, on the one hand, it's sad because we don't want our leaders to have those kinds of troubles. We want them to be examples. But then again, it also helps because we can then relate to them. Because wow, those people have the same kind of problems that we have. Apparently, it doesn't matter how big your name is, how big your office, how big your title, how great your family's history. Apparently, every family has problems of one type or another. Every family has dirty laundry to deal with at some point. Trouble haunts even the best families. Now, we all want to protect our family's name, and we all want to protect our family's reputation, but we all have to admit that all of us have a crazy aunt in the attic somewhere. Okay? We all have that person or those people or those situations we wish nobody would ever find out about, and yet somehow they do. And even if they never find out about it, we know about them, and they hurt, and they labor us, and they weigh us down. And it doesn't matter how much wealth or how much power, how many limousines you have, all families are subject to discord. I think that is true now, and it was true all the way back into the time of David. I can just imagine that the tabloid reporters of ancient Israel had a field day with the family of King David. Let's review last week. Last week, we remember that David had received a covenant from God, a covenant like that of Abraham, like that to Moses, like that to Noah. He was one of those special recipients of God's promise. But what happened in that case? After he received that covenant, after he had success on the battlefield and success in government, he started to get lazy. He started to get a little sloppy. And the scripture tells us that one season when his army went out to fight one of his wars, a war that was started because of a sort of an insult, a tweaking of the nose, a tiff between leaders, David sent out his generals, Joab and Abishai, to fight his battle for him. And it says in the scripture that in that season, when the kings usually go out to war, David sent his army, but he stayed home. And while he was at home, and I begin to wonder as I study this story, did he mean to stay home or not? I mean, did he know it was going to happen or not? But the story tells us that while he was home, he was walking around on his balcony one night, and he saw a woman bathing, and he was overcome with lust. Now, this wasn't just some random woman, as if that would have made it okay. This was the wife of one of his lieutenants, one of his mighty men, one of the knights of his round table, a man named Uriah the Hittite. But David brought her into his home. He enforced his royal privilege. He took her and he got her pregnant. He sent her home. Well, when she told him that she was pregnant, he realized that this would be scandalous. So what did he do? He called her husband, Uriah, home from the battlefield. He was out serving the king. Called him home from the battlefield and said, hey, it's great to see you. Thanks for the report. Why don't you go down and see your wife? In the back of his mind, he's thinking, if he'll go see her, he'll stay home one night, bing, bam, boom, problem solved. We all know what soldiers do when they come home to visit their wives. Well, that's everybody else. Apparently, Uriah was the world's biggest Eagle Scout. He didn't go home. He slept on David's doorstep. So David said, okay, I gotta get this guy with his wife. So the next night, he had a special dinner, a welcome home dinner for Uriah. He got him drunk. He said, now go visit your wife. David crashed on his couch. David's got a problem. He's committed adultery with Uriah's wife. It's, within a matter of weeks, it's going to become apparent. And he's going to become apparent. Sorry, the pun just knocked that. I apologize. Can we edit that out of the video? And he knew he had to take care of this problem, so what did he do? He wrote a letter to Joab. We all know Joab. Joab is, he's basically David's cleaner. He's the one who takes care of David's dirty work. He's also his chief general. He writes a letter to Joab telling him to put Uriah in the front of the fighting so that he will be killed. And then he takes the letter, he puts his royal seal on it, and he hands the letter to Uriah to deliver to Joab. He asks him to deliver his own death warrant. And what happens as a result? Uriah is killed in battle. He moves forward, the rest of the troops pull back, he's left to be slaughtered. Well, as we know, David then, thinking that the scandal had been averted, he then calls Bathsheba into his home, pretends like this whole thing is on the up and up, marries her, and we know that later they will have a child. But then one day, sometime later, he's visited by his advisor, his prophet, Nathan. And Nathan, as though he's just come off the street, he's just witnessed something, comes up and he says, there was a man who had a little sheep all of them, and he loved it, but there was this rich guy next door who had a visitor, and the rich guy had lots of sheep, but he wanted to give something to his visitor, so he took the poor man's single lamb, his one lamb that he loved like a daughter, and he slaughtered it, and he fed it to his visitor, his important visitor. And he cared absolutely nothing about what that meant to the poor man and his family, the fact that he had only one and he had many. And David heard this story. He says, I cannot believe this sort of thing is happening in my kingdom. That man deserves to die. That man deserves to be punished. He should pay back that other man, many times over. And in the greatest gotcha line of history, Nathan points to him and he says, you are the man. And David is impaled on his own words. And we know that as the story goes, David repents, and from that comes one of the greatest psalms of repentance we've ever heard. It comes from Psalm 51. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and restore a right spirit in me. Cast me not away from your presence, O Lord. Keep not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of your salvation, and renew a right spirit in me. And this is the prayer that comes of that. But we hear from the lips of Nathan that even though David is forgiven, there will be consequences to his action. And there are specifically three things that Nathan says. Number one, Nathan tells David that because he has killed Uriah, the sword will never depart from his house. Blood for blood. You took the life of Uriah in battle, you will never have peace in your house. It's fascinating that when Solomon takes the throne later, he has this whole reign of peace. David was always embroiled in some kind of conflict. Second, and this is a strange one. We're going to come to this one again later. God says, all of your wives are going to be taken from you. They'll be given to someone else because you've taken the wife of Uriah. And one day somebody's going to take your women from you. Just like you took the one from Uriah. We'll come back to that one in a second. But thirdly, Nathan tells David that the son that he and Bathsheba had together would be taken from him. And the child was. Now, they did have another child. His name was Jedediah, also known as Solomon. And we'll come to his story a little bit later. But, of course, we know that David's immediate response was to confess his sin. And he did. And it was a beautiful confession. And they all lived happily ever after. Right? Of course not. This is the Bible. And this is the Old Testament. So we know there's more to the story. So now we turn to the story of Absalom. And there are going to be some parts of this story that I skipped, some diversions, but I'm going to stick with the main story here. We know that David had many wives, and he had many children with those wives. And among them were three that we need to know: Amnon, Tamar, and Absalom. Amnon was the half-brother of Tamar and Absalom. Now, Tamar was very beautiful. And Amnon, her half-brother, became infatuated with this young woman. Even though she was his half-sister, and even though she was several years younger than him, he absolutely fell in lust with her. And so Amnon one day feigned a sickness. And he asked David to send Tamar into him to take care of him while he was sick. It was a request that seemed reasonable to David, so he obliged. But when she came to him, Amnon grabbed Tamar and forced himself on her and committed incest. He raped her. I mean, I can't even imagine what that level of betrayal and hurt would be like. But to add insult to injury, Tamar, realizing that things had changed for her, not that she loved him, but that now she was no longer a virgin, she was no longer pure, she no longer met those standards for marriage and everything like that. She said, well, I guess we're going to have to get married. And what did Amnon do? He says, oh no, you're used goods now. I'm done with you. I don't like you. I just wanted you. And so Tamar was utterly disgraced. This is one of those places in the story where we could take off on a whole tangent about domestic abuse and incest and all those sorts of things. But we're going to stick with the main story. After she was raped, she was absolutely disgraced, and she ran to her brother Absalom's house. And there she mourned. She mourned publicly. She put ashes on her head. She tore her clothes. And Absalom was absolutely heartbroken. So he went to the king. And what is just heartbreaking, what's shocking, is the brevity with which King David responds to the news that one of his children has raped another one of his children. The Bible tells us only that when David heard what Amnon had done, he was, quote, very angry. That's it. He was very angry. And Absalom, I'm sure, was standing there looking at him saying, that's it? That's all that's going to happen? You're not going to do anything? I mean, this is not some woman from the village. This is not some, just some random person, as though that would have made it right. But this is your own daughter. This is my sister. David did nothing but be very angry. But that wasn't enough for Absalom. Absalom hated Amnon for what he'd done to Tamar. But he sat on that hate. He stewed on that hate. He smoldered in that hate for 2 years. And then one day, Absalom decides that he's going to invite all of his brothers out to see one of his livestock operations. They're going to have a nice day out at the ranch. He's going to have a nice picnic. He's going to have all his brothers out there. He even invites the king. He said, why don't y'all come out and see what I've been doing? I've got some great livestock. I'm very proud of what's going on here. Maybe it could be a model for the rest of the country. Why don't y'all come take a look? And so David decides to stay home, but all the brothers go out to Absalom's place for a picnic. And when that happens, while they're out on this leisurely day in the country, at a pre-appointed time, on a pre-appointed signal, Absalom gives the order, and his men, his hands, jump on Amnon and murder him. They assassinate him. Finally, blood for blood. Finally, Absalom has been able to take his revenge. Absalom had told his men, wait until Amnon gets drunk, then on my signal, kill him. Don't be afraid, I'm the one who's given the command. And that's exactly what they did. When the other sons of David saw it, they didn't know what to think, so they all just got on their mules and fled. And what's fascinating to me is throughout this story, it's that people are fleeing and charging on mules. Apparently mules were a lot different. I was thinking about these, I was thinking about the Knights of the Round Table, like they're charging on mules. The mule's different from the donkey. I was picturing the donkey. But they all got out of there. But now, Absalom, even though he had exacted his revenge on his brother, now he was a fugitive. He had assassinated the son of the king, even though it was his brother. And even though he was a rapist, he had not done this with any authorization. He had not done this with any kind of direction from the king. Well, of course, when word got back to David, he was torn apart. He had one son who was dead, and now he had another one who was a fugitive. He was on the run. He was living in the land of Geshur under the protection of the king of Geshur. What's going on in David's mind at this point? David, he was heartbroken that one of his sons was dead. He was also heartbroken that another one was gone. He was in exile. He couldn't come back because he was a murderer. So what was going through David's mind at this point? Well, had his inaction in the rape of Tamar caused this trouble in his house? And we're told that at the death of Amnon, David was comforted. And did David feel that this vigilante murder was justified? He hadn't wanted to do anything about it, but maybe now Absalom had taken care of it. At least he hadn't put his own son to death, but the problem seemed to be taken away, except that now Absalom was a fugitive. David just stays in this limbo, not wanting to make a move to the right or the left. The scripture tells us that David longed to go and to see Absalom. But was the pain of losing two sons, one to death and one to exile, too much for him to bear? David was on the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, he couldn't bring Absalom home, because then he would have to bring home the murderer to justice. And the other brothers of Amnon would demand that Absalom be killed for Amnon's murder. But David couldn't leave him in exile either, because his heart was breaking. His son was gone. So what could he do? What was he supposed to do? What did David do? Well, as in the case of Tamar, he did nothing. He just lived in that limbo of decision. But think about that. What an untenable choice for David. To enforce justice on a child or to grant mercy. What do you do? What does a father do when one of his children hurts another one of his children? What does a father do when one of his children kills another one of his children? How do you handle that? Enter Joab. Remember who Joab was? Joab was David's military commander. As a character, the Bible portrays him as someone with the patience and people skills of George Patton. He was a hard-bitten soldier who acted variously as the king's general and occasional hitman. And whenever he saw a problem, he felt that it was his deed to fix it. It was his job to fix it. Even if David had a problem that he could not untie, it was Joab's job to cut the knot, or at least that's the way he saw things. And apparently Joab thought that David was paralyzed by his indecision over Absalom's fate. And so Joab decided that he needed to move the ball down the field. And he decided to trick David into making a decision. And so what did Joab do? Chapter 14 tells us that Joab went out and he hired a woman to play the part of a mother in mourning, who would come to the king with a great problem for the king to solve. And the woman came to the king with this story. She said, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation, she said, "I'm a widow. My two sons had a fight out in the field, and since no one was there to stop it, one of them was killed. Now the rest of the family is demanding, 'Let us have your son. We'll execute him for murdering his brother. He doesn't deserve to inherit his family's property. But if I do that, I'll have no one left, and my husband's name and family will disappear from the face of the earth.' 'Leave it to me,' the king told her. 'Go home and I'll see to it that no one touches him.' 'Oh, thank you, my lord,' she replied, 'and I'll take this responsibility if you are criticized for helping me like this.' The king said, 'Don't worry about that. If anyone objects, you bring them to me, and I can assure you that they will never complain again. So the woman then asked him, she said, may I ask you one more thing? She said, why don't you do as much for all the people of God as you have promised to do for me? You have convicted yourself in making this decision, because you have refused to bring home your own banished son. All of us must die eventually. Our lives are like water spilled out on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. That is why God tries to bring us back when we have been separated from him. And then she said this, God does not sweep away the lives of those he cares about, and neither should you. Now let's rewind this for just a second. Did David not see what was happening here? I mean, apparently David did not see that he was being set up again, just like Nathan had done it. I mean, if you want to get something by David, go and tell him a story to his face, get him all riled up, and then you can get whatever you want out of it. I mean, did he just not see this coming? This woman comes in and says, why won't you bring your own son back into the kingdom? I'm sure Joab's over on the side saying, I can't believe this worked. I really can't believe he fell for this again. Somebody comes with a heartbreaking story and he pronounces judgment on himself, but that's what he did. David was utterly convicted by his own words. But it wasn't just that he was tricked, it was that the woman brought wisdom with her. That even God tries to bring us back when we've been separated from him. She said, God does not sweep away the lives of those he cares about, and neither should you. And so David allowed Joab to bring Absalom home. And they lived happily ever after. Sorry. Absalom did return home, but for 2 years, he wasn't allowed to see his father. I mean, here Absalom thought that he was being brought home to be reconciled with his father, but instead of being reconciled, he was exiled in his own country. He had been exiled in another country. Now he was exiled in his own father's house. After 2 years, Absalom couldn't stand it anymore. Why is my father still angry with me? Why won't he see me? Why won't he come to me? Why won't he let me come to him? And so he went to Joab. He said, Joab, he wrote that. Joab said, please set up an audience with my father. Please make this happen. Joab didn't even respond to his mail. Didn't send him any message back. At that point, Absalom decided, I need to get Joab's attention. And so what did he do? He went and he burned down Joab's farm to get Joab's attention. Remember to answer those phone calls and return those texts and emails. Somebody might burn down your house. But that got Joab's attention, and finally Joab went to Absalom and said, why did you set my field on fire? The prince told him, you've got to let me see my father. Either that, or if there is some iniquity in me, if there is some crime that he is holding over my head, if there is something that he has against me, then he needs to kill me. He needs to serve me justice. I can't live in this no man's land anymore. I cannot be ignored. So Joab went to the king and he told him. And the king finally called for Absalom. Finally called for his son. And Absalom came and he bowed before the king. Bowed himself on his face. And the king bent over and kissed him. Beautiful moment of reconciliation and forgiveness. It was on all the front pages of the paper. All the optics were right. And they lived happily ever after. Amen. Sadly, sometimes we can say that we forgive someone, and they can say that they receive our forgiveness. Sometimes we can say all the right things, and it just doesn't stick. Because there's still too much hurt, there's still too much brokenness, there's still too much pain. Remember, I've told you time and time again that the Bible tells real stories about real families. And while we would love for this story to end with this picture of Absalom and David embracing, that's not where it ends. We want it to end like the story of the prodigal son, don't we? Where the father welcomes the son back into his arms, and they really did live happily ever after. But here are a couple of notes I think we need to make at this point. As we look back at the story so far, let's just identify some things that we need to think about. 3 tragic developments. First is that the sins of the parents are not only repeated, but often magnified in the lives of their children. Especially when we as parents are not actively involved in our children's lives. Especially when we don't help them to learn, not only from their mistakes, but from our mistakes. You know, when it was necessary for David to act, it was not Absalom's sins that paralyzed him, it was his own sin that paralyzed him. And look at the tragic results of his paralysis. One of the things we see is that parents who fail to appropriately discipline their children are also failing them and God, and will reap the consequences of that behavior. Next point, people who are given power receive it from God and have a duty to wield it appropriately. I don't believe that executing Absalom or absolving him were the only 2 options that David had. And I don't think that exiling him was necessarily the only option either. But we have to remember that God has given us parental authority. And we have to remember that we've not been given that authority to leave it on the shelf. But another important point here is the sin that is kept private, conflict that is kept private will fester. And it will grow until it explodes in a very public way. Whether we want to confront sin or not, whether we want to confront conflict or not, one day conflict will confront us. It cannot stay buried forever. And that's what leads to the next phase of the story. Because the crisis between Absalom and David exploded in a very public and national way. I mean, all parents rebel against their children. Excuse me, all children, well, that may be true too. All children rebel against their parents. But most of the time, that has to do with personal self-differentiation, growing up, adolescence, that sort of thing. But Absalom became so heartbroken, so estranged and frustrated that his rebellion took the form of an actual rebellion and civil war. That's interesting. To kind of set this up, chapter 14 tells us this. Now, no one in Israel was as handsome as Absalom. From head to foot, he was the perfect specimen of a man. He cut his hair only once a year, and then only because it was too heavy to carry around. When he weighed it out, it came to 5 pounds. I mean, seriously. He had 3 sons and 1 daughter. His daughter's name was Tamar. She was very beautiful. And Absalom lived in Jerusalem for 2 years without getting to see the king. So even though David had forgiven him, no contact. Absalom came home, but the resentment between he and his father never quite healed. So why did Absalom rebel? Was it that the affair over Amnon and Tamar had made him lose all respect for his father's authority and ability to govern? Was it a deeper hurt that he'd been ignored for 2 years after he came home? Was it that he felt that he should have been vindicated for slaying his rapist brother, not just forgiven? We may never know that ancient pain. But Absalom began to wonder, wouldn't I make a better king than my father? I would have never done it this way. When I'm a parent, when I'm a king, I'm going to do it differently. I had that conversation with one of my kids the other day. You know, after he had had his phone taken away, came back at us with, when I'm a parent, I'm going to make sure that the punishment fits the crime. That sort of thing. Get over yourself. We just took your phone for a week. But that's how Absalom began to think. If I were the judge, then people could bring their problems to me and they'd actually get justice, not like with my paralyzed father king, David. And so Absalom began to plot his course of action. First, he asked David's permission to go to Hebron to make a vow to the Lord, just to basically go and see this holy site. And David gave him his blessing, saying, "Go in peace." You know how ironic that the last thing on Absalom's mind was peace. He was starting to sow the seeds of a violent revolution. Because when Absalom got to Hebron, he sent agents all over the countryside to gather support. And they did. People started to flock to his banner. And there, Absalom declared himself the true king in Hebron, the same place his father had declared himself king in Hebron. He was claiming not only to be king over Israel in general, but Judah in particular. He was claiming not just a political identity, he was claiming a prophetic identity, going all the way back to Genesis, to the legacy of Judah. That he would be Israel's true king. And of course, David over the years had been very successful, but he still had lots of political enemies, and they all flocked to Absalom's banner. They all undermined the king's effectiveness. And so quick and overwhelming were the numbers drawn to the prince in his meteoric rise to power that David and his government realized that they were overwhelmed. They were outmatched. They had to flee Jerusalem. They had to move the whole capital out of Jerusalem when Absalom started moving up from Hebron to the capital city. And then, as though decades of old revenge were coming to roost on David's house, Absalom entered the palace. David had left. He took the government with him, but he left his family, not his children and stuff, but he left most of his family in the palace, including his concubines, his harem, his lady friends. And Absalom went into that court, went into David's harem, and claimed them all for himself. He said, "Everything that you have is mine. Everything that makes you a man, everything that makes you king, everything that makes people call you sire is now rightfully mine." Remember when Abimelech did that to Ishbosheth, the son of Saul? It's the ultimate insult to a king. I'm not only taking your kingdom, I'm taking your closest, intimate family members. It's all mine now. And it was just as Nathan had foretold. Nathan told David that one day somebody will take your wives and they'll be given to someone else because you've taken the wife of Uriah. This was a catastrophe. This went beyond scandal. David was totally disoriented. But his generals weren't. Joab was not disoriented. They knew that the only way that David and his government was going to survive this is if they struck back, and if they struck back hard. And so they began to muster the troops. They began to prepare for battle with the usurper. But as they gathered their forces, as Joab prepared the men, David went to his captains. He gathered his leaders, and he said, "For my sake, deal gently with young Absalom." In other words, I want you to put down this rebellion, but I want you to deal gently with my son. That's a mixed message, isn't it? He is the leader of a traitor army, but he's my son. Take it easy on him. So, reading from 2 Samuel, chapter 18, beginning in verse 6. Excuse me. The army of David engaged the army of Absalom. So the battle began in the forest of Ephraim, and Absalom's troops were beaten back by David's men. There was a great slaughter, and 20,000 men laid down their lives that day. 20,000 men. Those are Civil War battle type statistics. 20,000 men. The battle raged all across the countryside, and more men died because of the forest than were killed by the sword. There was so much panic. There was so much disarray. People were falling off cliffs. They were falling down hills. They were impaling themselves on roots. It was horrible. It was a desolation. During the battle, Absalom came unexpectedly upon some of David's men. He tried to escape on his mule, but as he rode beneath the thick branches of a great oak, his head got caught in the branches. His mule kept going and left him dangling in the air. This is why you tell your teenage son to get a haircut. An irony of ironies. Absalom's pride and joy is hair. It's what would eventually get him killed. One of David's men saw what had happened and told Joab went back and told Joab, I saw Absalom dangling in a tree. What? Joab demanded. You saw him there and you didn't kill him? I would have rewarded you with 10 pieces of silver and a hero's belt. I wouldn't do it for 1,000 pieces of silver, the man replied. We all heard the king say to you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, please don't harm young Absalom. And if I had betrayed the king by killing his son, the king would certainly find out who did it, and you yourself would have been the first to abandon me. So Joab said, enough of this nonsense, and then he went, and depending on the translation, he either took 3 daggers or 3 javelins. And he went up to the dangling Joab, and I'm sure there were some words between them, some monologue or speech. And he impaled the son of the king while he was dangling in disgrace by his hair from a tree. You know, war is very often an opera of ironies. Absalom's crowning glory, his hair, betrayed him, and he dangled him before his enemy to die. Of course, news of the battle arrived in David's camp. The rebels were defeated. David inquired about his son and says, okay, great, we won the battle. What about Absalom? Is the young man Absalom safe? To which the messenger replied, may the enemies of my lord and king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. In other words, he's dead. And I'm sure the messenger was expecting that this great victory, this salvation of the kingdom would bring some kind of joy to David's heart, but instead the king was overcome with emotion. He went up to his room over the gate of the city and burst into tears. And as he went, he cried, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Word got back to Joab. Joab was furious. 20,000 men had died that day to clean up a mess that started because you couldn't handle discipline in your own house. 20,000 men, 10,000 families, 5,000 families, mothers, sons, daughters, children are weeping tonight because their children are dead, defending you and your kingdom, and the best you can do is come up here and weep for your son, the leader of the army. He said, my king, that is really, really messed up. You need to get out there and you need to go and thank your soldiers. Now, there are a lot of times when I don't like Joab, but there are some times when I do. And I think he was right. And David did too. And he went out and he took his place at the gate and welcomed and thanked his men as they returned from battle. You know, as I think about this story, we're going to stop there. We're going to stop there as far as the story goes. As I think about this story, one thing that convicts me is just the pain in a father's heart. The pain, this great tragedy. But as I thought about this story, I mean, the next few minutes is just going to be some of my reflections on this. I don't know if there's going to be so much theology as much as it's going to be just where I feel like the Lord's talking to me in this passage. One of the things that convicts me about this story is that in many ways, I'm led to kind of hold this story in tension to the parable of the prodigal son told by Jesus. I want you to think about this. And you've got a prodigal in both stories. But in that story, Jesus lays out before us an ideal situation. A child sins, he repents, he returns to his father. His father embraces him and he forgives him, and they live happily ever after. You know, and that story is the complete picture of reconciliation, repentance, and forgiveness. But we know that was a fictional story. Jesus tells it as a fictional story. It's a parable, a story that's possible, but nonetheless fictional. The story of Absalom and David is true. And although we may all aspire to live toward the ideal of Christ's parable of the prodigal son, all too often we find that our own families resemble more that of the broken family of David. But God knows that. He knows the number of hairs on our heads, knows our family's needs, knows our family's brokenness, knows our struggles, but also knows our possibilities. There are lots of lessons that we can take from this story. Some of these were summarized beautifully by one of our great First Pres Sunday school teachers, John Carter. One thing, David confesses his sins. Absalom allows his sins to fester. David glorifies God and humbles himself. Absalom exalts himself and takes matters into his own hands. David is in a relationship with God, but Absalom is not. We see in Absalom what David might have been without God. Beautiful, charismatic, skilled. But David was in an active relationship with the living God and had godly people around him who were able to hold him in check when he could have been, most of the time, in his absolute worst. When did David make his biggest mistake with Bathsheba? When he was back at the palace by himself, not with his godly friends and counselors. We have lots of lessons we can pull from this story. But as this lesson developed, there were other thoughts that I just couldn't let go of. And I realized that some of these I just had to share with you. For example, the first thought is that every family, even the best families, the ones with the greatest names and best reputations and best history and pedigree, all have problems. I want you to think about this family. This was not a family of limited means. This was not a single-parent home. This was the royal family of Israel. They had everything that they could possibly need. This was not a single parent. By all accounts, there were multiple parents in this home. And yet there were still problems. Absalom, for all his outward appearances, had everything going for him. He was a born leader. He was striking in appearance. He wasn't a loner or an oddball. This family still had problems. I remember, two funerals that I've done. One for a classmate of mine at W&L whose parents were members of my church. Basically committed a self-inflicted overdose of heroin. The second was one who OD'd on drugs, again for the same sort of reason. It was a kind of an over-medication to suicide. One was from one of the greatest Christian homes I've ever seen. Well, actually, both of them were. The other was also from one of the a member of one of the first families of South Carolina. Prominent, wonderful, godly people. If you'd told me, did either of these two families do anything wrong? I'd say no, they did everything right. Their kids were good. They were great people. But sometimes because of mental illness or because of hurts we don't understand or whatever it is, there are just problems in families that are just bigger than us. And there's no easy resolution. Another thought of this story. Sometimes the problems that someone has in a family, that an Absalom has, sometimes it's a personal problem, sometimes it's a system problem. If you think about mechanics, in a machine breaks down because there's uneven pressure exerted on the weakest part of the machine. Sometimes it's not that that part was broken necessarily, it's that the whole machine's out of balance, but it manifests itself in that one most vulnerable part. Families are a system, and sometimes the problem with the kid is the problem with the whole family system. I think Absalom was a victim of being a part of a really broken family system. But because they were the royal family, nobody was going to say anything about it. Another is that this presents a classic dilemma. To enforce justice on a child or grant mercy. What happens when one of your kids does something horrible to another one of your kids? How do you satisfy both the justice you want to provide for your one child and the mercy that your parent's heart wants to give to the other? All of us can say, well, David should have done this, and David, really? Are we going to be that person and say, well, this is what he should have done, in that situation. Have any of us been in this situation? I haven't. And as much as I see the brokenness of it, I'm not going to condemn David, because I don't know that I would have been any better. I'd like to think that I would have. But this is a tragic dilemma. This was the dilemma before God. You know, what do I do when the children that I love hurt the other children that I love? How do I resolve that? How do I ensure both mercy and justice? You know, do I stick my guns? Do I forgive? Fourth, how many family grudges or conflicts could be avoided or alleviated if someone, anyone, would just be the first to say, I'm sorry? Somebody just step up and have the guts to say, I'll bury the hatchet. I didn't start this. Maybe I'm not even at fault. Maybe I'm not to blame, but somebody's got to start the healing process. Somebody's got to have the humility, the vulnerability to say, you know what? I'll take it. I'll bear the burden. I will bear this cross. Now, too often, our hurt and our blame and our sense of justice and responsibility overwhelm us, and it all morphs into pride. We say, I'm not going to do it until she does it. I'm not going to move till she says or he says he's sorry. Another one. Sometimes problems go deeper than simple one-time forgiveness. We saw that in this story. Sometimes it's not just about saying I'm sorry or forgiving somebody. It's a process. It's not a pronouncement. It's a process. And sometimes even professional medical intervention is needed, because sometimes it's not just about responsibility. It's about healing. One of the reasons sometimes why we forgive people and we don't feel forgiven is because we need the healing to catch up with the posture. And if we allow the feeling to undo the position, to undo the forgiveness, then we get sucked right back into that vortex of estrangement and animosity. Next one. We all have an Absalom in our lives. One. Or we are an Absalom in somebody else's life. Children, siblings, parents, family members who betrayed us. We've all got somebody in our lives that's like Absalom. Maybe they've gotten tangled in their own hair and their own sins. Maybe they've gotten themselves into fatal circumstances. You know, maybe they're people who've done violence to other family members through all manner of abuse. Maybe they've done it to themselves by means of drugs or alcohol or just some kind of self-destructive lifestyle. But we all know an Absalom in our lives. Final thought is this, that parents invariably wish that they could take the consequences of their children's actions on themselves. Parents invariably wish that we could bear their burdens. You know, I don't think we can express it any better than David expressed it himself. Oh, my son, Absalom. Oh, my son, Absalom. If only I could have died instead of you. Oh, my son, my son. If only I could have been bullied instead of you. Oh, my daughter, my daughter. If only I could have been shunned instead of you. Oh, my cousin, my cousin. If only I could have OD'd instead of you. Any person who's ever felt love for another, real love for another, has felt that on some level. What I have to confess is that the story of Absalom and David is a story that offers us no easy answers and fewer promises. It presents us with no formulas that tell us that by doing A when someone else does B will result in C. Or that X can be prevented if only Y is done at the right time and in the right way. No, rather what this story does is it puts before us a question, and the question is this. how badly do you want it? How badly do you want it? How deeply are you committed to this gift we call family? And how broadly and deeply and how patiently are you prepared to love? Think about what that wise old woman said to the king. Our lives are like water spilled out on the ground which cannot be gathered up again. That is why God tries to bring us back when we have been separated from him. He does not sweep away the lives of those he cares about, and neither should you. You know, when David was on the run from Absalom's army, he took time to put his thoughts on paper. And the words he put on paper are the thoughts that reflect the grief he felt, but they're also words that testify that David knew that when we have reached the limit of our resources, God has reserves of grace, reserves of power kept in heaven to strengthen and to encourage and sustain us through whatever crisis we may face. Ultimately, we do not find the resolution to our pain, to our angst in this story itself, because this is a human story. We do not find the resolution and the power to confront this kind of pain until Easter morning, when the Son of David comes up with the solution that David could never have achieved for himself. The good news is that this story doesn't end here. Hope is left, and hope is still alive, because even though we do not have the answers, even though we don't have the power to make a difference, even though we don't have the resources, we know the one who does. God in Jesus Christ proved his love for us in the cross, on the cross of Jesus Christ. He proved there that even though we are sinners, his patience for us is everlasting to everlasting, and while we were yet sinners, he died for us. And he proved it by his own nail-scarred hands, nail-scarred feet, and spear-pierced side. That's how far he said, I'm willing to go for you, all the way beyond death. But he also proved in that moment on Easter morning that he has the power to make a difference in our lives. I think that one of the purposes of this story of Absalom is to show us our utter hopelessness on our own. We can't do this alone, and we can't do this without God. But David's Psalm 3, which was composed when he fled from Absalom, his son, gives us the only hope we have for dealing with those Absalom moments. He wrote, Lord, how they have increased to trouble me. How many are they that rise up against me? That's not just people, those are problems. But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory and the one who lifts up my head. I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of tens of thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. The beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the power of the living God is he can take the story of Absalom and David and he can transform it in eternity into the story of the prodigal son and the reconciling father. The reason that the story of Absalom is so tragic is because we do not see the end in God's grace. So I wouldn't want you to stop reading here, but rather read it through the lens of the one who loves us so much and actually does have the power to reconcile and heal that which is broken. With you and me and with our Absaloms. Let's pray. Lord, I know that this has hit close to home with lots of people in this room. I know that there are people here who have struggled mightily with an Absalom in their lives, and I know there are others in this room who have been that Absalom for other people. Lord, we have all been David, we have all been Absalom. Some in this room may have even been an Amnon or a Tamar. It's all a big mess. That's why we thank you that the story didn't end on this human level, but rather ended not even on the cross, but with the resurrection of your son, showing us that you do have the power to make a difference in our lives, that you have resources beyond what we have, and that you are our shield, and the one who lifts up our heads. So, Lord, encourage us in this, even as we walk through these civil wars in our lives. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.